It's just after midnight on a chilly November evening in Edinburgh as two men sneak into the local cemetery under the cover of darkness. With only the light of the moon and a single lantern to guide them, they make their way through the seemingly endless rows of headstones until their feet hit soft ground. This grave was only filled that morning. Here, they begin to dig. There are many stories in history about desperate men who turn to stealing from the dead in order to survive. This is not one of those stories, because the prize that these men seek is not a valuable object hidden away inside a coffin, but rather the corpse itself. They are known as Resurrectionists, and this is a story about death, greed, and the birth of modern science as we know it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Historodame, and today, we're learning all about the horrifying crimes of 19th century body snatchers. The desire to understand the intricate workings of the human body is one that dates all the way back to ancient times. There were a lot of things that could kill a person back then. Animal attacks, people attacks, natural disasters, injuries, and all kinds of illnesses from infection to the plague. In a world that could seemingly cause your death at any turn, it is only natural that people wanted to understand how our fragile bodies worked in order to prevent that. And what's the best way to understand what goes on inside the human body? Well, dissecting it. Unfortunately, throughout much of recorded history, the practice of cutting open the dead in the pursuit of knowledge was often prevented due to questions of morality. In many cultures and religions, the idea of defiling a corpse in such a way was considered highly dishonorable. Many civilizations banned the dissection of humans entirely, making it particularly hard for anatomy to be studied. In ancient Greece, for example, the dissection of any human body was illegal on Greek soil. However, during the rule of Ptolemies, some scholars discovered a loophole in which they were allowed to study bodies in conquered territories. But outside of a few cases, most scientists studying anatomy would have to make do with animal dissections instead. Thus we have the works of the Roman physician Galen, who made great strides in the field by studying the anatomy of Barbary apes. Galen's work would be used by anatomists for centuries after his death, in many cases acting as a replacement for actual hands-on experience. However, significant advancement in the field would not be made until people had the opportunity to study actual human bodies. This came about in 13th century Germany, under the rule of Emperor Frederick II, when human dissection was finally declared legal, but this could only be done once every 5 years. Throughout the next few decades, similar laws would be passed in other countries around Europe, but like in Germany, they also heavily restricted how many bodies could be used. It wasn't until the 1700s that regulations would be loosened to provide more subjects for anatomical study. The Murder Act of 1751 in England, for example, allowed for the bodies of murderers to be dissected after their execution. This helped the supply immensely, but the Industrial Revolution was just around the corner, and things, especially in the field of medicine, were about to get crazy. The early 1800s were a time of rapid advancement, not only when it came to production and quality of life, but also in the fields of science and medicine. Thanks to laws that legalized the dissection of executed criminals, great strides were made when it came to the study of anatomy. The number of men seeking to pursue a career in medicine was growing faster than ever before, but unfortunately this new influx of medical students created a demand for cadavers that the current system just could not fill. With supply so low and demand so high, doctors and medical professors had to turn to other means in order to acquire bodies for dissection. They began offering obscene prices to whoever could bring them a fresh enough body for their studies. As you might imagine, the result was grave robbing for profit. Now, of course, stealing anything from a grave was very illegal. Items that belonged to the deceased were considered to be the property of their family, and someone caught rifling through a coffin would be facing harsh punishment. The actual dead body, on the other hand, didn't fall into the category of property, meaning that it didn't belong to anyone, and therefore stealing a corpse was technically not a crime. This loophole, combined with the money offered, ended up making corpse theft a surprisingly lucrative career option. Those who partook in this act were known as Resurrectionists, and they were a scourge across Europe, North America, and especially Britain. Your basic grave robbing operation looked like this. Usually the men would work in pairs, paying off the cemetery watchmen so that they could work uninterrupted. They would begin by finding the grave of a recently deceased person. Then they would lay out a sheet next to the site and begin digging, placing any excess dirt onto the sheet. Once the coffin was uncovered, it would be carefully opened before the body would be secured with ropes and pulled out head first. Any personal items would be returned to the coffin before the grave was refilled, and the corpse would be carted off to wherever the deal would take place. But things were not always so straightforward. There are many accounts of things going horribly wrong during attempted grave robbings, including fights breaking out between the thieves, poorly planned escape routes, and getting caught in the middle of the act. Many successful resurrectionists were part of gangs who stole bodies regularly, but sometimes it would be the medical students themselves who were desperate enough for a subject to practice on. There are recorded cases of young students digging up a body, only to get caught immediately because they didn't think about how they were actually going to get it back to their school. There's actually one funny story where a group of students were caught by a tollkeeper with a stolen body, and decided to pull a weekend at Bernie's and pretend it was their sick friend. Yes, being a resurrectionist was risky business, but it usually paid off. The average price for a cadaver could range from between 10 to 20 pounds, but if the deceased had a particularly unique medical condition, then it could sell for much higher. When all was said and done, everyone got what they wanted. The doctors got their practice subjects, and the thieves got their money. The only problem is, there was still one group of people left, and they definitely weren't happy. As the scourge of grave robbings continued to increase, the general public grew more and more furious. These were people who had just lost their loved ones, only to find out that their graves had been defiled and their bodies stolen, sold, and operated upon. And worst of all, the government wasn't doing very much to stop it. It wasn't long before public outrage reached its breaking point, and soon the people began to fight back. They started taking countermeasures in order to protect their loved ones, keeping watch, reinforcing their grave sites, and even setting traps to stop potential body snatchers. Some families would inlay large flat stones above the coffin, ones that were so big and heavy that they would take more than 2 men to lift and carry away. Others would use a mort safe, which was a heavy cast iron cage that was placed around the grave and secured with a padlock. More extreme cases involved people setting traps, like a shotgun that was activated if someone walked too close to a gravesite, or the account of one man who claimed that he rigged his son's coffin to explode when it was opened. But in general, the best that most people could do was simply camp out and keep watch. These watch parties consisted of friends and family of the deceased, who would take turns protecting the gravesite. This became so normalized that it was soon a regular part of the mourning process, and would be done for around 2 to 3 weeks after someone died, in order to ensure that their body was decomposed enough to be useless for dissection. Cities were locked in a stalemate. The resurrectionists would not be deterred, and the public would not give up trying to protect those who passed away. Things were about to reach their tipping point, and eventually, it would come to the Scottish city of Edinburgh in the form of murder. With increasing monetary gain to be made by selling corpses, it is only natural that more depraved individuals might choose to skip the grave robbing step entirely and just acquire bodies through other means. There is perhaps no one more famous for this than William Burke and William Hare, 2 men from Ireland who ran a boarding house in Edinburgh, where they would kill their tenants and sell their bodies for profit. Now, Burke and Hare didn't initially set out to become serial killers. The first death under their roof happened innocently enough. When the 2 men discovered that one of their lodgers had died, and no one came to claim the body, they decided to sell the corpse to a well-known anatomist, Dr. Robert Knox. Of course, this was initially meant to be a one-time thing, but when another lodger ended up falling ill in their care, they were worried that business would suffer, and so they chose to eliminate the problem and sell this body to Knox as well. After this, it appears that Burke and Hare got a taste for blood, because they would go on to kill 14 other people, inviting each of their victims back to the lodging house, getting them drunk, and then smothering them with a pillow. Each of these bodies would be sold to Dr. Knox, who would use them for demonstration purposes in his medical school. 2 of the victims were even recognized while they were on the public operating table, and some of Knox's students remarked that it was unusual that such healthy individuals would have died from seemingly no reason. Their reign of terror would only end, however, when Burke and Hare's final victim, Mrs. Marjorie Campbell, was discovered by other people visiting the lodging house before she could be sold to Dr. Knox. By the time the police were called and finally got there, however, the body was already gone. Burke and Hare would be arrested and tried for murder, but with no bodies of their victims to be found, there wasn't enough evidence to get a solid conviction. In the end, Hare was convinced to testify against Burke, resulting in Burke being found guilty and executed for his crimes. Perhaps rather fittingly, his body was later used for dissection, and his skeleton was displayed in the Anatomy Museum at the Edinburgh Medical School, where it can still be found today. Hare, on the other hand, was cleared of all charges after testifying, and was free to leave the city. The crimes of the Resurrectionists, combined with the grisly murders committed by Burke and Hare, were the final straw for the government to do something about the situation. This, among other incidents, would finally lead to the passing of the Anatomy Act of 1832, which would allow greater access to bodies that could be used for medical study. The unclaimed bodies of the poor, as well as those who died in prisons or workhouses, could now be used for research and practice. The act also allowed people to donate their own bodies to science. This bill would largely bring an end to the Resurrectionists, who no longer found money to be made in the digging up and selling of corpses. And finally, the public could be at ease, knowing that their dead would once more rest in peace. Hey everyone, thank you for watching! If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or a comment down below. If you want to see more content like this, you can also subscribe to my channel, and keep up to date on all the fun history videos of the future. But for now, I bid you farewell.